I'm okay. I'm sorry. I was having a little bit of a hard time finding the link, which had to do not with you at all, but
Oh, no, no problem at all. I'm amazed that I can do anything on the computer. So,
Ryan the Farmer, Part 12.
I'm your host, Dr. Alexis Hazen. I'm a board certified plastic surgeon who specializes in breast surgery and gender affirming surgery and cosmetic surgery. I have a holistic approach to wellness and longevity. I've been practicing in New York City for over 20 years and continue to learn and educate as an associate professor at NYU Langone. Please join me in our mission to discover Zen.
welcome to the Dr. Zen podcast. Today, I'm really honored to have Dr. Maya Shetreat as my guest. She's a neurologist, an herbalist, an urban farmer, a ceremonialist. She's a teacher and a healer. She's also an author. She's written a few books, one called Dirt Cure, and also The Master Plant Experience, The Science, Safety, and Sacred Ceremony of Psychedelics. And she's also the founder of the Train Institute. And that's just a tiny snapshot of the many amazing and wonderful things she does. So welcome to the podcast.
thank you so much for having me.
And I thought I'd like to just hear a little bit about how you went from being a neurologist to, this vast experience and interest you have in herbal medications and what you do now.
Well, you know, I, it is a kind of circuitous journey, but I think the one thing I would say first is that um, my starting point uh, was probably not so conventional. So I became interested in going into medicine after seeing a Bill Moyer special when
Hmm.
I was probably in, I want to say maybe high school or college, and it was called Healing in the Mind.
Hmm.
I had been like, I mean, doctor had been on the possible list, but
Hmm.
when I saw this special, they were exploring all of these different ways into healing that I thought were fascinating, including one where they had done this kind of experiment in a sense with a young girl who had lupus and was having renal failure from her meds. But every time they'd stop her meds, she'd have a flare. So they were in this lose-lose situation, and they thought, well, let's do this approach of giving her castor oil every time they would give the meds. And
Hmm.
then they stopped giving her the meds eventually and just gave her the castor oil, and her body responded as if she were getting her meds, but without any side effects.
Wow.
So yeah, that I was like, whoa,
That's so
this is
cool.
amazing. And they said this is this new field of medicine called psychoneuroimmunology. And I thought that is what I want to do. I want to be a psychoneuroimmunologist. So I wrote my medical school essay about that, and they accepted me. And I was an English major. I guess it was a good essay.
Good background.
And then went into med school, and of course we know how med school goes. It's programming experience and very immersive, and you kind of forget all the reasons you went there when you're in that very long kind of training. Plus I also got married and started having my babies through med school residency and my fellowship in pediatric neurology. So then my son, my youngest, got sick
Hmm.
at a year of age. And he started having these asthma symptoms, came along with some neurological regression. And of course, here I am in my pediatric neurology fellowship and
Of course.
running to different doctors. And everyone's like, yeah, like, I don't think it's anything, but I'm watching this whole situation
Progression. Yeah.
unfold. And, that took me into, I was the scientific literature, right? I
Yeah.
mean, no one had
Yeah.
any answers. I thought, well, this is what I was taught to do, evidence-based medicine. I'm going to look in, PubMed. And what I started to see, and this was long, long, long before anyone talked about the gut-brain connection, was all of this information that was, not on the front page of the New York Times, but buried in the science. And So that kind of took me into his food and his diet. We got him off of soy finally after I went to many doctors, and some of the most famous, well-known doctors kind of refused to test him for his just allergies, even though he had hives and welts and all these things. And ultimately, he was allergic to soy. His asthma went away, and it took some years to kind of recover.
Mm.
But now he is, of course, a strapping 18-year-old college freshman. But it was a journey. And, what that took me into was looking really outside of the box in
Mhm.
terms of food and herbs and, ultimately mind body. And then eventually, looking into more spiritual paths as well.
Well, it's so interesting because there is such sort of reluctance on the part of conventional, um, Western medicine to even look at diet. I mean, really, and you think about all the factors that were involved in your son's getting sick and then getting well, and the big thing was just what he was allergic to and what he's ingesting. And it's fascinating that our resistance to that. So then that sort of led you into the path that you now are on and have continued to be on. And how did your kind of your practice evolve?
Well, so, initially after having this big success with my son, wanted to, of course, apply that with my patients.
Yeah.
And, went out into the world and, of course, thought I was going to do regular pediatric neurology, and ultimately was sort of practicing integrative medicine in the job that had hired me before I had this sort of awakening in my fellowship, because there weren't too many pediatric neurologists. There still aren't. So, they try to get you early. And, so I kind of was in this mainstream practice offering integrative medicine, much to the evolving chagrin of the many other multi-specialty practitioners there, including a big pediatric department.
Mhm.
And although eventually I left that practice, it was just not a good fit, as you could
Mhm.
imagine.
Yeah.
But once I left, all of them were then prescribing probiotics and omega-3s, and vitamin D was very controversial back then. So this was, at the very beginning of my career that I came kind of out of the gate with all of these ideas, which were
Yeah.
based in scientific literature. But yeah, so that began kind of my work and ended up, becoming a very big private practice that was, I was seeing patients who were coming from all over the world, just because there were not very many pediatric neurologists who were conventionally trained but had this other perspective and
Mhm.
these other approaches.
Yeah, there was probably one of you.
There was exactly one of me,
There was
I think, at
exactly
that
one.
time. Now I think there are a few more, thankfully. But then, actually that same son, a number of years later, we discovered there was mold in our apartment, which probably was why he was having those food allergies to begin
Right,
with, right?
right. Because it sensitized him, and yeah.
Years before mold exposure, another topic nobody in mainstream medicine really
Yeah.
likes to talk about, all too unwieldy, can't just treat it with a drug, pill for the ill. But
Right.
but we ended up moving out of our apartment while we had a huge mold remediation for 5 months, and then moved back in. He was doing really well by the time we moved back in, and then he had a first time seizure
Oh,
in
wow.
the epicenter of where the mold had been. The thing was, though, that the whole place had been remediated.
Mhm.
That room had been stripped down to the studs.
Wow.
There was no mold. We even had, none of the same upholstered furniture. The
Mhm.
place had been cleaned literally with like toothbrushes on the
Mhm.
door jambs. It was tested. So there I am, holding my little, at that time, 7-year-old,
Wow.
um, and
Terrifying.
terrified, and thinking to myself, like, just in a kind of knowing in my whole body that
Mhm.
this was not just physical.
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
I was doing all the things already.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
was
yeah.
doing everything that I could do. And I was the only person he probably would have been sent to by
Mhm.
any of my colleagues at that point. And I just knew this is something energetic or
Yeah.
spiritual or soul related. And I
Mhm.
was um, just floored because although I had been in the integrative medicine world, that was really, I didn't know people who could help me
Mhm.
with that. And ultimately, I started to study. I had a very eventful, kind of almost mythical, like finding the teacher, being turned
Mhm.
away, going back, right? I mean, it was like a whole story. And
Mhm.
ultimately ended up going to Ecuador for a number of weeks that I didn't speak the language. I didn't know anybody on this trip. I was scared of any number of things that might have come up there, and they all did. Right,
Uh-huh.
we just crashed in a small plane. We snakes and
Oh
insects and
no. Ah.
all of the things you can imagine kind of did happen. But here I am,
Yeah.
and there, I really had a very seminal experience with San Pedro cactus,
Mhm.
which is a master plant, a psychedelic master plant. P.S. There was no mention of any psychedelic experience as part of this trip. And in fact, I'm sure I would not have gone if I thought that was a part of it because I was
Right.
a young mother and a
Yeah.
neurologist and a doctor. It wasn't in vogue at that time
Mhm.
to go do
Mhm.
psychedelics in the jungle.
What year are we talking about?
This was a little over 10 years ago
Okay. Yeah.
now.
So yeah, no, it wasn't. I mean, now the past 5 years, I would say it's sort of become much more common knowledge that, these have medicinal purposes, but yeah.
Everyone's going to do their psychedelics in Costa Rica and Mexico and
Yeah.
Peru. Everybody's got their journey.
Yeah.
Not back then. I mean, it was happening obviously, but um, yeah. So I had this very powerful experience, which really I think I've been unpacking for
Mhm.
the full decade plus since that happened, and hence my book and the
Mhm.
work that I'm doing training psychedelic informed practitioners and a lot of the other things that I've been doing to really share a balanced approach
Mhm.
to plant medicines, whether they are herbals or psychedelic master plants, any of those.
Okay. And can you tell me a little bit about your experience with the psychedelics? What you felt or saw or realized? And I know it's hard to sort of put a huge experience that was actually life-changing into a couple sentences, but
Yeah, well, and the truth is, in a lot of these experiences, they're not really anything that you can describe
mhm,
words so clearly. It's
yeah.
oftentimes a shift in a shift in understanding or perspective on it could be in a relationship, it could
Mhm,
be on what you do with your time, it could be on
mhm,
something that's happened to you, or it could be on your whole life, right?
yeah.
So for me, I really had like a visitation from like a being.
Wow.
And this is actually, I would say, common for people with master plants. And one of the differences I notice a lot of times, because now, people do have access to ketamine in
Mhm.
legally, ketamine clinics. Um, I'm talking, for these medical psychedelic
Sure.
experiences.
Yeah.
Um, and soon to be MDMA as well. And what I've never heard, and this isn't to say it couldn't happen, is
Mhm.
somebody saying, I was told by MDMA that I should forgive my mother, or ketamine said I'm worthy of love. Like you will hear, I learned in that,
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
discovered in my MDMA journey, but across the board, you will hear the mushrooms told me, ayahuasca said,
Mhm.
I saw
Yeah.
San Pedro, right? Like, so these are the kinds of differences that I've seen with what we call master plants and let's say just a substance or a compound, right? Or a drug as
Yeah. Yeah. And how would you describe master plants? Like, what's the difference between a master plant and a plant, or a master plant and a psychedelic?
So master plants are an indigenous term. And, I do not speak, of course, for indigenous people who are a very, very diverse and varied um, number of different people and perspectives. But uh,
Sure.
across the board, master plants is this term for um, powerful plants that change human consciousness and the course of human behavior. And not all master plants are psychedelics. So coffee
Mhm.
would be considered a master plant,
Mhm.
cacao, right? Uh,
Yep.
Master plant, tobacco would be a master plant, and so all psychedelic plants, though, and these are flora, fauna, fungi, not it's not a botanical term, right? It's
Right, right.
are all, if they're psychedelic, they are considered masters. And why they're called master plants is because they're considered teachers or masters that are
Mhm.
transmitting ancient wisdom that humans need to know in
Mhm.
order to navigate the human experience. And what we know actually is that a lot of cave art, and I, of course, none of us were taught this, back in the 8th grade or whenever we learned
Right.
that stuff. But a lot of cave art is actually not in the front of caves, right? I thought, oh, cave art is, what did people do with their days and their primitive
Yeah,
language, right?
right.
No, they were actually, a lot of cave art, which is why this is still being discovered, was in the very back of caves, in
Mhm.
these hidden, no light,
Mhm.
low oxygen, ceremonial areas that actually had pictures of kind of shamanic pictures, right? Half human,
Mhm.
half animal, but
Mhm.
also pictures of mushrooms, of cacti, and sometimes even DNA evidence
Wow.
of those. So cave art is sort of like, even still, is this sort of secret underground um, evidence that
Yeah.
we humans have been engaging with these master plants and relying on that healing and that wisdom since the beginning of time, the beginning of our time.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like this cave art is just like a window into that. And it provides a doorway so you can see what's been going on for centuries, probably. May-
Millennia. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things you mentioned is that, the healing powers of these plants, flora, fauna, and such, and there is memory and cellular memory that's connected in all of us. Can you like link up the dots on that?
Of course. So I think we're learning a lot now, thankfully, about the kinds of experiences that we have in our lifetime, often even as children, maybe times we don't even remember. And
Mhm.
even it could be uh, in utero or
Mhm.
in, lineage, right?
Right.
Epigenetic.
Yep.
That these traumatic experiences actually imprint in our bodies.
Mhm.
And they don't have to be what we call capital T trauma,
Mhm.
right? But we do know with what we call capital T trauma, for example, what would go under the category of adverse childhood events, for example, which could be, divorce or a parent being incarcerated or uh, death of a caregiver or abuse, things like that unfortunately are fairly common. uh,
Yeah.
but those would be kind of capital T traumas, but there could even be little t trauma, right? Like bullying or not being picked up on time every day, right? A sense of unsafety
Mhm.
or neglect. All of these kinds of things actually translate into our cells, and our cells actually remember them. So the way I think of it is our cells understand a lot of different languages. They understand physical stressors, but they also understand mental, emotional, and even spiritual stressors. and then they translate it into physical symptoms,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So that's this, and the structure of the cell changes,
Mm-hmm.
even down to the mitochondria, right? We all think of mitochondria as these like energy makers, the
Yeah.
engine of the
Sure.
cell.
Powerhouse.
Right, yes, the powerhouse of the cell. And it turns out that mitochondria are very they're sentinels, and they're sampling the environment all of the time and communicating within the cell to other organelles and to other cells, whether they're in danger or not. So when a cell perceives itself to be in danger by way of the mitochondria change structure, where healthy, optimal mitochondria that feel safe, right,
Mhm.
are branch spaghetti shaped. And mitochondria that are in danger mode, right, in protection or defense mode, are meatball shaped. They're actually not branched. They can't exchange nutrients as well. They can't release waste as well. They're not in the same kind of communication. And so the cell is functioning suboptimally from the standpoint of growth, but very
Mhm.
well from the standpoint of defense and danger. So
Right.
what we then see is that the cell itself starts to change its function, and what neurotransmitters or hormones or the way things are released, cytokines, right, that are indicating whether the body should be inflamed or in fight or
Mhm.
flight, or all of those things start to spread from that cell to neighboring cells, and from those cells globally, right, throughout the body. And
Uh-huh.
that changes the microbiome,
Mhm.
that changes the nervous system, that changes the immune system. And ultimately, over time, if that doesn't reverse, right, like let's say after 7 days, if you have, I
Yeah.
don't know, strep throat, or, a couple weeks, if you had the flu, then what happens is you get stuck in this chronic cell danger mode, right? And activates all of the cells in the body to behave differently. And that is how we're starting to see that disease ensues, right?
Mhm.
Autoimmunity or neurodegeneration or any number of other conditions.
So, I mean, this is so fascinating, and it's so understudied. If you think about all the things that we have studied in medicine and in this, I mean, it's really just like the tip of the iceberg of this field. So, if you take somebody, well, all of us who've had, some form of trauma. I mean, even birth, you know, being birthed is a trauma. Um, and what you're saying is that, that imprints in your cells, and they remember it. And so, in a way, the trauma sort of gets trapped in the body. So how can one use psychedelics or master plants, with or without psychedelics, to help release these traumas that really all of us experience, and in some cases, more big T traumas than small T traumas, which are obviously can be devastating to your health and well-being, and now we're understanding that it's not just your mental health, that it's your actual physical health.
Exactly. Exactly. And yeah, I agree with you that the money that we put towards studying different, topics, let's
Yeah.
say, in the medical field is sometimes flabbergasting to me,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
to that we have to see how sometimes we have to prove the obvious, uh,
Yeah.
instead of really doing these deep dives into something that affects probably every single human being. uh,
Right.
so there are a lot of ways to look at how psychedelics and psychedelic master plants physiologically create that shift. Uh,
Hmm.
and, on one level, just, we know that DMT, which is a molecule that's found in actually a lot of plants, and not just plants, but mammals. We
Yeah.
ourselves actually make DMT in, tiny amounts in our own central nervous system. So we have like this endogenous entheogen, you would call it. Um,
Mhm.
but DMT, it turns out, is actually it binds to a receptor called the sigma 1 receptor. And
Mhm.
um, what we know about that receptor is it actually is almost like an antioxidant receptor. It works to optimize mitochondrial function
Oh,
and
wow.
endoplasmic reticulum
Mhm.
function.
Mhm.
So there is this profound protective quality on a literally physical level
Yeah, cellular
happening,
level.
right? That most people don't talk about
Mhm.
benefits on a physical level or on a physiologic level that we experience from a psychedelic experience, certain psychedelic experiences. But beyond that, we also know that these pathways that become very wired into us, right? Because of these experiences that we've
Sure. Yep.
and it's happening on a mental level, and it's happening on a physical
Physical
level.
level. Yeah.
People with depression have fewer synaptic connections between neurons in their brain.
Mhm.
So our physical structure and our wiring is influenced by our experiences and maybe our traumas. And so what we know is that the psychedelics actually help us to rewire. And
Mhm.
they do that in a few different ways. In one way, they create plasticity,
Mhm.
neuroplasticity. And so areas of the brain start to communicate that wouldn't normally communicate. We create more connection between neurons. So there's that aspect of it, is this connectedness that
Mhm.
is sort of engendered by a psychedelic experience on a physical level. But then the other piece is, we have this network, this constellation of different parts of our brain called the default mode network. And the default mode network is literally what we do when we're in default mode, meaning like we're staring out the window in the car, right? Like watching things
Mhm.
go by, and we're daydreaming, or we're also maybe perseverating, or spinning out, all of the things that we do when our brain is kind of in a non-attentional mode. And that part of the brain also suppresses long lost trauma memories and
Yep.
old emotions and so on. So when that part of the brain becomes, and that's our ego, kind of a major part of our me network, right?
Mhm.
That keeps us in persona so we can be out in the world and successful and not be, derailed by our emotions every
Yeah.
minute. When that part of the brain um, gets too out of control, right? It's
Mhm.
too aggressively doing what it's doing. We can become very rigid,
Mhm.
and and that is really thought to be, at least in part, some of what's behind things like OCD and major depression and addiction behaviors and other things, eating disorders, where there's this wiring and it's like we don't know how to get out of it, right? It's like a
Yeah. Yeah.
groove that's so deep. So what psychedelics can do in big experiences is take that default mode network offline for a period of
Mhm.
time. And one of the things that happens by way of the default mode network is something called predictive coding. And predictive coding is basically this: you go into a room, you think you see every single detail in that room,
Mhm.
but in fact, you're not. You're seeing
Yeah.
only a few details, and everything else you fill in past experience. Now,
Mhm.
it's very effective and efficient in terms of operating from the wisdom of past experience and
Mhm.
also survival, right?
Mhm.
Because we don't want to have to like look for every
Yeah.
detail to see a
Reinvent the
pumpkin in our
wheel.
face,
Yeah.
right? Like, so that's helpful on the one hand, but on the other hand, it means we're always filling in our old experiences
Mhm.
into the now, right? So we're never
Right.
really experiencing the present moment as it is. And this is, I think, part of the story of triggers, right? Like triggers
Yeah.
have become a very big part of our vocabulary. And,
Mhm.
part of that is we're realizing, oh my God, like I'm not always living in this moment.
Yeah.
I'm experiencing the past all of the time in the present. So when default mode network is taken offline, we also have this predictive coding kind of pulled away, so that
Mhm.
suddenly we see a different quality in our reality, because it's not just with all of the things that we're always filling in sort of in shorthand. We can suddenly see things more as they are, right? And so we become, in a sense, like the audience,
Mhm.
and not just like, the robotic actor doing the same things again and again because of, our predictive coding.
I mean, it's fascinating, and you think of, I mean, we know this to be true in so many examples, like not the least of which is criminal lineups, like people, and when people recount what happened or what they think they saw as eyewitnesses, they're often adamantly confident that what they remember to be true is true, and they're often wildly wrong. So this just this goes along with a lot of things that we do know. What plants and substances is DMT in?
Well, so they're in a number of different substances, and people will talk about the ayahuasca brew
Yeah.
commonly, but ayahuasca itself doesn't contain DMT. It turns out what ayahuasca does is, so the ayahuasca brew, many people don't know, is not just ayahuasca. It's ayahuasca combined with the chacruna plant or a number of other possible plants that do contain DMT. The thing is that we break it down with enzymes in our digestive tract. And what ayahuasca does is actually blocks those enzymes. Now, the interesting part of this is that, this was all discovered by, and of course, learned from indigenous people who didn't know about MAOI,
Right.
And didn't know, have microscopes and so on and so forth. And again, when the bioprospectors or the anthropologists who went and learned about this from these different indigenous tribes, asked them, how did you know that you had to combine these two plants?
Yeah.
I don't know if you've been to the jungle, but I have, and there are hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
Many of which don't look that remarkable. And so to know this one, you have to do right, and then you stew them together for hours. I mean, and they say the plants told us. The plants told us. And they're like, that's bullshit. Basically, right? Like all these people from our Western culture think that sounds nutty, but they don't care. They still take back the information. And most people also don't know that about 70 to 80% of the medications, pharmaceuticals that we use today in the OR, we prescribe and so on, were derived from a tiny percentage of plants in the jungle. And all of that information came by way of indigenous people that then, ended up being synthesized, and so on and so forth. Right. But what's fascinating is all of these answers, right, about what the plants do, how they have to be prepared. Oh, this one has to go under the skin. This, right? All they say, we learned this from the plants. The plants told us.
I mean, it's really fascinating, and you're so right. I mean, most of our medications do come from plants and do come from originally or fungi or living existing. They're not actually chemically based. So now, with all your work, you've learned how these plants can be used and how they can help inform and rewire and get people out of certain sort of mental patterns that are really unhealthy. So how do you figure out who is a good candidate to use these medications and who is not a good candidate? Because I'm sure that there are some clients, patients who really would not be in the right frame of mind to benefit from the use.
So it depends on what dose. It depends on what plant or compound. In the case of, let's say, ketamine or MDMA, someone wants to engage with. But what we right now know is that there are some absolute contraindications, and the main one right now is psychosis. So somebody who has had any kind of psychotic episode, or who has a first-degree relative who has had psychosis, would at this time be considered contraindicated. Now, it's interesting, of course, because we're learning about the impact of trauma in schizophrenia.
Yeah.
So, this is like really interesting, and maybe eventually life-saving, right? To understand the underlying, it's not just genetic, right? Like we've been saying forever and ever, we've been told forever and ever. So how that will unfold, I do not know with time. But at this time, right, the one thing we don't want to do for someone who already has a very bendy default mode network, very like wobbly default mode network, is to then kind of make it more wobbly. So so that is considered a contraindication. And a lot of people would also say bipolar disorder, at least. And I will add here that a lot of bipolar is misdiagnosed these days, in young people especially, but also in adults. I heard figures of like about 50% of young people and about 25% of adults don't actually qualify as bipolar, but carry a bipolar diagnosis.
That would check out with what I know. Yeah.
So it is really important to do the homework on, really what happened and if that diagnosis is valid before somebody is turned away. But, again, you don't want to kind of catapult somebody into a manic episode and put them at risk in that way. And then there are some other, depending on the plant. So some, like ketamine tends to be pretty safe for most people. But people who are on SSRIs or, MAO inhibitors, certain kinds of antidepressants are in many cases contraindicated from, let's say, like MDMA, or it turns out probably mushrooms are going to be safe for a lot of those people. But right now, that is considered a contraindication for a lot of these experiences, but not for ketamine.
Okay.
So, and of course, this gets a lot more granular, like, but like cardiac, right? Other things, particularly with things like ayahuasca or iboga, which are have more potential side effects or interactions with other pharmaceuticals or drugs or so on. And, iboga, if you have a cardiac condition, you need to get lab work and an EKG.
Yeah, you need to get cleared for this.
Yeah.
So what do you see as the biggest benefit of the use of these plants in, whether it's mental health issues or physical? Where do you see it sort of now, and then where do you see it going?
Well, so I will say that every study that we have seen published always includes professional support before, during, and after. So these studies that show this kind of success for smoking, for alcohol addiction, for any number of other addictions, for major depression, PTSD, life-saving, absolutely life-saving. There's always support. This is not, not to say there's no way it could help in a different kind of circumstance, but the studies are not, somebody doing this in their basement or out in the forest.
Right.
They're being held in a very particular kind of container. And overall, that's been true for indigenous communities too, that it's been ceremonial. It's been done with a healer. We could all discuss, are there opportunities to take advantage of people? Is it always right? Because for me, what's interesting is that my indigenous teachers that I've studied with, they don't say, oh, these are good. They don't call them psychedelics. They don't call them compounds. They don't call them drugs. They call them masters, right? And they say these are not good and they're not bad. They're powerful.
Yeah.
Right. And if we look at like, tobacco, or we look at the coca plant, right? Like, which, cocaine.
Right.
And look at the opioid epidemic.
Yeah.
Right? All of those come from plants that are considered masters. So it is really, really important, I think, especially because there's a lot of now commoditizing and farmers getting involved and all of this now. I don't know what's going to happen, but if I were looking at where things are right now, I think there are some people for whom this kind of experience is life-saving,
Yeah.
absolutely life-saving. And I think it is incredibly important that this is made available to those people in a safe way and in an affordable way.
Yeah.
And then I actually think that a big way that more people are going to benefit from master plants, let's say mushrooms, for example, will be microdosing, which
Yeah.
is sub-psychedelic dose. I am not, the party line and the kind of psychedelic movement right now is this is something, kind of good for everyone should do. I don't think that's the case, or at least I don't think everyone should do it all of the time, right? I think
Yeah.
there are some people for whom it might never be the right thing, and there are some people for whom it may one time be the right thing, and that might not be now, right? But we do see that microdosing has a lot of powerful potential for mood, for depression. It's being looked at for Alzheimer's.
Yeah, I've been reading
Dementia, it's
about
being looked
that.
at in Parkinson's, it's being looked at in ALS, it's being looked at for asthma and autoimmunity. And I have seen very profound response in, anecdotally in my work. And I think we're starting to see that in the literature as well. It's just more difficult to study because until, it's no longer classified as illegal, right? No one's going to go into the clinic and spend the whole entire day having a sub-psychedelic experience with a microdose.
Right.
They don't want to let these, just kind of put it out into the world because right now an IRB is not going to allow.
Not gonna, yeah, absolutely. What advice do you have for people who are interested in using these for medicinal purposes, in terms of finding access and finding a healer?
Well, so this is a little more complicated because of legality, which varies based on substance and based on location. So it's decriminalized in a number of places in the country, in the US, and is, legal in Oregon, that's unfolding as, a test case for the rest of the country and maybe the world. So in those places, there's a little more leeway. In other parts of the country, ketamine right now is the main option from a medical standpoint, unless you are going to travel. So, I educate people about what their options are, and then they can kind of determine, right? I am not going to give people advice to go do something that is not legal.
Right.
I don't think that benefits, anybody. But that said, I think what's very, very important is what I said before, which is support.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of, there's a whole spectrum of both wonderful, profoundly, amazing in the science and spiritual, kind of bridging those, right, that are clinically trained. So there are those people, and there are more underground people who could also be wonderful. And then there are a lot of kind of less savory people out there as well. And psychedelics are unique in that, especially with a large dose, the person is incredibly vulnerable, right? And suggestible. And so there's a lot of potential for harm with people who don't have their ethics in place. And right now there's not really a governing body, so this is an evolving situation, I would say. And there are some great people, MAPS trains people. There are other programs. I have a program as well where practitioners are coming through the program so that they can, have the whole foundation, whether they're going to offer, an experience to somebody or just advise them, right? Advise their patients or advise their clients. So I would say, be careful.
Yeah.
And really do your homework. And that goes for substances too.
Mhm.
Like I've heard some pretty hair-raising stories of doctor, kind of wanted to help a patient, a great doctor, I think,
Mhm.
wanted to help a patient, and that patient, ended up with somebody who this doctor had encountered at the grocery store, right? Like very weird, not great
Not
kind of
savory. Yeah.
experiences. Now, with fentanyl and other things, like we just have to be so careful.
Careful. Yeah.
Um, and so that's what I would say is make sure you have a trusted resource. Um,
Mhm.
not just me, there are other people. Take a look at my
Yeah.
book or other really good books that are out there, and educate yourself um, before diving in.
I mean, I think that's wonderful advice. And just to wrap up, I mean, it feels like we are in a very difficult time in the world, a difficult time in this country. And um, do you sort of do you connect any hope of recovery in terms of healing as a nation, as a world, connected to these medicines?
Absolutely. And this is something I go into great depth around in my book.
Mm-hmm.
I think it all comes down to this feeling of loneliness and
Yeah.
wanting to belong. And, we now know that loneliness is pretty much the number one killer. Uh, on top of, it tops smoking a pack a day, it tops alcohol abuse, it tops
Yeah.
a lot of things that we would have thought
Mm-hmm.
were, the bigger killers. Loneliness.
Right.
And loneliness is not just being alone, it's
Right.
feeling,
Feeling
right?
alone.
And I think probably the vast majority of people in this country have some element of that right
Mm-hmm.
now, based on just the politics and the state of affairs, and this was before the pandemic, that
Yeah.
was already a problem for people. Of course, the
Sure.
pandemic and, what's been unfolding in the world has just made it much worse. So, um, and then, one of the things I talk about in my book is existential loneliness. And this is, I
Mm-hmm.
think, part of the human condition, which
Yeah.
is um, are we just these like why are we here? And are
Right.
we connected to anything more?
Yeah.
And is this, even meaningful in any way, right? And so I do think that psychedelics and the infrastructure, the ceremony, the
Mm-hmm.
space holding, and ceremony, by the way, you don't have to go to Peru, right?
Yeah.
It can happen in a clinic. Ceremony can happen anywhere. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, you could go to, a ceremony and it could be not really very ceremonial. So
Mm-hmm.
having that space being held, feeling safe, and heard and seen, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of those things, I think, help us to emerge from
Mm-hmm.
this sense of existential
Yeah.
loneliness and ultimately, you know, loneliness as we are experiencing it, in the here and now. And I think that is really a big part of the the healing, right? Do I think these are going to solve all our problems? No.
Yeah.
We have to solve our
We
problems
do.
such as we
Right.
can.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
but could they facilitate that? Can they open the window, open the door? And then if we decide to walk through that door,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or act on what we see through the window, absolutely, they can be allies in helping us change human consciousness and
Mm-hmm.
human behavior.
Amen to that. I mean, I think I think everything you're speaking about really speaks to the times and what we're going through as a people, as a culture, and really in the entire world. So I really appreciate your expertise and the courage you've had to pursue this, because it's, it is so non-traditional, and coming from the world of medicine that we do come from, I know how hard, this, I'm sure this was not easy. So I really appreciate the steps that you took and the courage that you had to embark on this. So thank you so much. This has been so informative, and I know that our listeners will really love hearing about it. Dr. Maya Shetreat and author and neurologist, herbologist. Really, really pleased to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
Zen Essentials, because your health is essential.